The candle flickered violently as if the air itself were trembling with anticipation, casting long, wavering shadows across the cold stone walls of the convent. Outside, a fog rolled in over the narrow streets of Lyon, muffling the distant clatter of carriage wheels and the low murmur of late-night voices. The bell above the convent's entrance tolled once, twice, and then a slow, haunting sequence that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of those who heard it. Inside, silence reigned, broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards and the faint drip of water echoing somewhere in the shadowed halls. And then, in the reflection of the large, ornate mirror hanging in the corridor, a figure appeared. A nun, her habit draped in black as though woven from shadows themselves, stared back with eyes that seemed both hollow and all-seeing. The sight was fleeting, vanishing the moment any rational thought tried to seize it, yet the chill it left lingered, curling in the hearts of those who witnessed it. Sisters who had walked these halls for decades found themselves unable to explain what they had just seen. Jean, a young novice of barely 16 winters, froze mid-step, her hand trembling on the wooden railing. It was her, she whispered to no one in particular, though the emptiness of the hallway seemed to respond with an almost tangible heaviness. The air carried the scent of damp stone and faint incense, mingling with something inexplicably metallic, like iron from freshly turned soil. The oldest sister in the convent, Sister Marguerite, known for her unwavering faith and stoic demeanor, shook her head as if to dislodge the vision from her mind, but even she felt a tightening in her chest that no prayer could soothe. Whispers began to stir, soft and hesitant at first, as the few who had glimpsed the figure recounted the fleeting apparition. Each retelling was cautious, almost fearful, for there was a collective understanding that such words might carry consequences beyond the merely human, an unspoken acknowledgement that this was no ordinary ghost story. The nun's appearances were never the same twice. Sometimes she was a mere blur in the corner of a mirror, so quick that one could almost convince oneself that exhaustion or imagination had conjured her. Other times, she stood fully formed, her face pale and lined with a sorrow that seemed ancient, as though she bore centuries of grief in her expression alone. Observers described her eyes as being impossibly dark, reflecting back not only their image but the deepest fears and secrets they carried. One witness swore that she had whispered a single word, "Remember," though no one could be certain if it was uttered aloud or simply felt in the hollow of the mind. These occurrences were never predictable, they struck in the dead of night when the convent was empty, and the few who saw her never encountered her more than once in the same night. This randomness fed the growing unease, making every reflection a potential portal to the unknown, every mirror a gateway through which the past might intrude upon the present. The phenomenon did not remain confined to mirrors. Some claimed that flickering shadows at the edge of candlelight carried her presence, stretching and twisting as if alive. Objects moved slightly when no one was near, and occasionally, a faint, almost imperceptible tolling could be heard even when the bell itself had long since fallen silent. These early signs were dismissed by some as coincidence, the product of overworked minds and sleepless nights, yet the pattern became undeniable. Those who had never spoken of one another's experiences began to exchange glances and hushed words, each confirming the other's terror. The atmosphere inside the convent shifted palpably, corridors that were once places of contemplation became gauntlets of dread, and the serenity that had defined the institution dissolved under the weight of the unseen. Fear became a communal presence, silent yet relentless, wrapping its tendrils around the hearts of everyone inside. Families in Lyon, initially skeptical, began to notice changes in the novices when they visited. Jean's parents, simple merchants of modest means, remarked on the sudden pallor of her skin and the way her eyes darted to corners of the room as though unseen eyes followed her. Sister Marguerite's own niece, visiting from a distant parish, described hearing sobbing in empty rooms and glimpsing a nun whose lips moved without sound. Letters sent home from the convent, once cheerful and mundane, began to carry an undertone of unease, describing long nights of unexplained disturbances and fleeting apparitions. The town outside remained largely oblivious, yet rumors slowly seeped through the narrow alleys, carried in whispers from market stalls and taverns, each retelling growing more elaborate, the story of the mirror-bound nun acquiring layers of dread and fascination that were impossible to ignore. Psychologists in later centuries might label these events as early cases of mass suggestion or hysteria, yet those who lived through them felt an immediacy that transcended theory. The fear was visceral, lodged deep in the nervous system, manifesting in cold sweats, sleepless nights, and a gnawing suspicion that reality itself had shifted. Candles were lit in every room, mirrors covered with cloth, and yet the apparition persisted, undeterred by the precautions of mere mortals. Some scholars of folklore would later suggest that the nun represented a liminal figure, a threshold between life and death, the known and the unknown, yet at the time, no framework existed to make sense of what was being witnessed. Each appearance, each faint echo of a bell, each sudden chill carried the weight of a story unfinished, a message unspoken, and a presence that refused to be ignored. Even in the quietest moments, the convent seemed alive with subtle disturbances. The flick of a shadow, the faintest echo of a footstep where none should exist, the metallic tang of fear in the air, these small details accumulated, layering the environment with tension and dread. The novices spoke less in daylight, their conversations replaced by cautious glances and hurried prayers. The older sisters moved with deliberate care, aware that the world they had known had shifted imperceptibly, yet irrevocably. And always, the mirrors remained, silent witnesses to the unfolding mystery, reflecting not only the image of the living but also the sorrowful, haunting visage of the nun who appeared only in the liminal hours of midnight. The bell would toll again, the reflection would shimmer, and the cycle of unease would renew, drawing every observer deeper into a narrative that had no clear beginning, middle, or end, only the chilling certainty of the unknown lingering just beyond the glass. Lyon in 1893 was a city caught between the echoes of the past and the hum of modernity, a place where cobblestone streets twisted like veins through neighborhoods steeped in centuries of history. Gas lamps flickered in the fog, casting pools of dim, golden light that barely penetrated the chill of the night. The city's architecture was a testament to its layered past. Ornate Gothic churches stood beside modest stone houses, and narrow alleys twisted unpredictably, creating pockets of shadow where the imagination could run unchecked. Markets bustled by day with merchants hawking textiles, spices, and curiosities from far-off lands, yet at night, those same streets were silent, save for the occasional horse-drawn carriage or the distant toll of a church bell. Lyon was a city of contrasts, its charm intertwined with an undercurrent of unease, where the line between tradition and superstition remained thin and permeable. The convent where the mysterious nun appeared occupied a commanding yet discreet position on a quiet side street, its stone walls thick and unyielding, ivy creeping up to obscure cracks and windows alike. From the outside, it was imposing but serene, its bells chiming with a measured cadence that reassured locals of order and devotion. Inside, the convent was a labyrinth of narrow corridors, candlelit chapels, and dormitories lined with neatly arranged wooden cots. The air carried a faint scent of incense and old books, mingled with the earthy dampness of stone. The convent's presence in Lyon was significant. It had long served as a center of religious life and moral guidance, its sisters respected for their piety, education, and charitable works. Yet beneath this veneer of calm, the institution bore its own subtle hierarchies and tensions. Older sisters, who had spent decades within its walls, wielded influence quietly but firmly, guiding novices through rigorous schedules of prayer, study, and menial labor, while maintaining an unspoken expectation of obedience and silence. Families associated with the convent were of mixed standing. Some were wealthy patrons who had endowed the institution with funds, while others were modest townsfolk who relied on the convent for education or spiritual guidance. Within this framework, the young novices existed almost like delicate vessels, subject to both the discipline of the convent and the watchful eyes of the community. Jean, the novice who first noticed the nun in the mirror, came from a family of artisans, her parents proud of her devotion yet unaware of the strange and unnerving forces she would soon encounter. The daily rhythms of life, prayers at dawn, chores in the cloistered gardens, study in dimly lit classrooms, provided structure, but they could not shield the sisters from the encroaching sense of unease that would gradually take hold. Even the simplest tasks began to carry a weight, as shadows lengthened unnaturally and mirrors reflected more than one's own image. The surrounding town contributed to the atmosphere of both charm and subtle dread. Lyon's inhabitants were deeply religious, their lives intertwined with a belief system that left little room for skepticism. Pilgrimages to local churches, rituals honoring saints, and seasonal festivals were all expressions of devotion, yet the same devotion also bred fear of the unseen, the inexplicable, and the morally ambiguous. Tales of apparitions, omens, and spirits were common in conversation, often dismissed as superstition by some yet treated with caution by many. In this environment, the reports of a nun appearing in mirrors could not be easily ignored. Stories circulated quietly at first, whispered among the laundry lines, the baker's stalls, and tavern tables, where each retelling subtly heightened the sense of foreboding. The townspeople, though largely removed from the convent's interior, began to sense that something unusual was unfolding, and even the most rational citizens found themselves uneasy in the face of persistent, unexplained reports. The political climate of Lyon in 1893 added another layer to the tension. France was navigating a period of rapid industrialization and political instability, with debates over secularism, education, and the influence of the Church frequently making headlines. The growing divide between religious authorities and civic governance created a subtle undercurrent of mistrust, particularly when matters touched on superstition or unexplained phenomena. The convent existed within this delicate balance, its authority recognized but quietly scrutinized. Clergy and laypeople alike were cautious in their public remarks, aware that rumors could easily spark controversy or draw unwanted attention. This tension between order and uncertainty mirrored the very mystery that was beginning to unfold within the convent's walls, amplifying the sense that something extraordinary, perhaps even dangerous, was quietly taking root. Daily life for those inside the convent was regimented but not without its quiet moments of beauty. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic patterns across stone floors. The gardens offered a small reprieve from the rigid schedules, with herbs, flowers, and vegetable plots tended carefully by the sisters. Birds sang from the eaves at dawn, and the distant hum of the city provided a constant, low backdrop to monastic life. Yet beneath these serene details lay the invisible tension that would soon define the narrative. Every reflective surface, mirrors in the dormitories, polished floors, and small silver-plated utensils, became potential sites of observation, each one capable of revealing the ghostly presence that would haunt the sisters. The ordinary textures of life, candlelight, footsteps, rustling fabric, acquired a duality, simultaneously familiar and menacing, creating an atmosphere in which fear could flourish unnoticed. Even the novices' studies reflected a duality between the known and the unknown. Religious texts and moral instruction were the primary focus, but lessons in history, geography, and literature occasionally introduced concepts that challenged or expanded the mind. While these subjects were designed to cultivate intellect, they also exposed young minds to ideas about mortality, the afterlife, and human frailty, concepts that resonated unnervingly with the inexplicable appearances in the mirrors. The combination of rigorous spiritual discipline, intellectual curiosity, and exposure to subtle fears made the convent a crucible for psychological tension, a place where the ordinary and the supernatural seemed to intersect in ways that defied simple explanation. The first signs of something unusual began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a whispered warning carried on the cold night air. It started with small reflections in the mirrors that seemed just a fraction delayed, as if the glass itself were bending time for a fleeting moment. A candle would flicker, casting a shadow that did not match the movement of the body it reflected. At first, the sisters dismissed these anomalies as tricks of fatigue or imagination, a product of long hours spent in prayer and quiet labor. Yet the consistency and timing of these occurrences slowly eroded that confidence. Mirrors, once considered tools for vanity or practical reflection, became ambiguous portals that demanded attention. The young novices, particularly Jean, were the first to notice the irregularities, sensing that the reflection sometimes carried a presence independent of the observer. Whispers began to ripple through the convent, quiet murmurs shared in the corners of dormitories or the cloistered corridors. The older sisters, who had spent decades within the stone walls, initially attributed the accounts to youthful imagination or the strain of religious devotion. Still, as the stories multiplied, a pattern emerged that could no longer be explained away. Jean described seeing a shadow at the edge of a polished surface, a figure draped in a habit, standing perfectly still while the reflection seemed to linger longer than it should. She recounted the sensation of being watched, a subtle pressure on the back of her neck, a sensation that left her paralyzed in fear and wonder. When she shared her experience with Sister Marguerite, the older woman's initial skepticism gave way to a careful, measured acknowledgement that something unusual, and perhaps dangerous, was unfolding. Children in the convent's care began reporting encounters of a more direct and emotional nature. They spoke of a nun who appeared silently in their mirrors at night, her face pale and sorrowful, her eyes wide with an intensity that seemed to peer into the depths of their souls. One young girl insisted that the figure had tried to speak to her, yet no words emerged. The impression was internal, almost like a thought forced into consciousness rather than a sound articulated aloud. These early accounts were fragmented, often dismissed as dreams or the result of overactive imaginations, but when multiple children described nearly identical experiences, the sense of inevitability grew. The innocence of the witnesses contrasted sharply with the weight of the phenomena, amplifying the unease that was spreading throughout the convent. Adults, too, began to notice the subtle but unnerving changes in the behavior of the children, sleep disturbances, withdrawn eyes, and sudden bursts of terror at ordinary reflections. Alongside these subjective accounts, tangible signs appeared that defied easy explanation. Faint scratches on the wooden frames of mirrors, small objects moved from their places without evidence of human interference, and an almost imperceptible chill seemed to gather around reflective surfaces. These occurrences, though minor individually, combined to create an environment in which the ordinary could no longer be trusted. Even those most committed to rational thought found their perceptions questioned. A simple glance at the dormitory mirrors became a test of courage, each reflection a potential site of confrontation with the unknown. Jean and a few of the more sensitive novices began to notice that the figure seemed drawn to those who were emotionally or spiritually vulnerable, lingering longer in their reflections than with others, almost as if aware of their inner turmoil. Attempts to rationalize the experiences were both necessary and insufficient. Sister Marguerite, while deeply faithful, could not entirely dismiss the accounts, and she began keeping careful notes of the time, location, and nature of each occurrence. Patterns were observed. The apparitions seemed to manifest most vividly at the stroke of midnight, during the hours of deepest silence, when human perception was most susceptible to suggestion. Observers noted the convergence of factors, dim candlelight, fatigue, and isolation, yet none could fully account for the precise and consistent appearances. Even skeptics within the convent acknowledged that the phenomena were unlikely to be simple coincidence. The cumulative weight of these subtle signs began to press on the minds of all who dwelled within the convent walls, gradually reshaping their understanding of reality and their place within it. The psychological impact was undeniable. Those who experienced the anomalies firsthand often described a mix of terror and fascination, a dual response that created both dread and compulsion. Jean admitted to lingering before mirrors long after the sighting, drawn by a combination of fear and curiosity, her own reflection seemingly inviting questions that she dared not voice. Sleep became restless, nightmares carried the figure into dreams that blurred the line between waking and unconsciousness. Even the most devout sisters found themselves questioning their understanding of the natural world and the spiritual realm. Faith, which had once been a source of certainty, began to feel fragile under the weight of the unexplained, leaving them susceptible to doubt and unease. Outside the immediate confines of the convent, the town began to stir with whispers of peculiar events, though specifics remained scarce. Travelers passing by spoke of a faint tolling at odd hours, though the bell remained unmoved, and some reported seeing dark figures reflected briefly in shop windows or puddles. These anecdotes, often filtered through layers of rumor and speculation, added an ambient tension that mirrored the internal unease of the convent. Within its walls, every mirrored surface became a potential window into a hidden reality, each flicker of shadow a reminder that the ordinary world was no longer entirely safe or predictable. The combination of early signs, subtle anomalies, and the psychological toll on the witnesses created a delicate, tense environment in which fear and curiosity were inseparable, preparing the ground for the more dramatic and undeniable encounters that would soon follow. By the end of this phase, the atmosphere within the convent had shifted irreversibly. Mirrors were no longer mere instruments of reflection but silent observers, capable of revealing truths too strange to be named. The novices moved with caution, aware that any glance could summon an uninvited presence. Conversations were hushed, and trust in perception became tentative at best. The stage was set for the first formal witnesses to articulate their experiences in ways that would escalate the mystery from subtle anomalies to a full-fledged, chilling enigma that would capture the attention of the entire town and, eventually, the wider world. The sense of anticipation was pervasive, a quiet dread that had seeped into the very stones of the convent, making the ordinary seem precarious and the unseen impossible to ignore. The first witnesses to the nuns' appearances began to speak with increasing urgency, their voices tremulous yet determined. Jean, still haunted by the initial reflection, recounted the experience to Sister Marguerite in painstaking detail, describing not just the figure itself but the emotions that seemed to radiate from it, a sorrow so profound it felt almost tangible, a presence that seemed both desperate and accusatory. Other novices, emboldened by Jean's account, began to share their own experiences. Each description was strikingly similar, a veiled nun appearing in mirrors at midnight, her face pale, eyes deep and dark, with a silence that carried more weight than words ever could. These first formal testimonies marked a turning point, transitioning the story from whispered anecdotes to documented encounters. The convent administration, initially hesitant to acknowledge the events publicly, found itself forced into a delicate position. The sisters were divided. Some insisted that the sightings were a test of faith, a spiritual trial meant to strengthen their devotion, while others grew increasingly concerned that something more sinister was at play. Parents of the novices were contacted, and the few who could visit were struck by the nervous energy that had taken root among the girls. Observers noted changes in behavior, anxious glances at every reflective surface, sudden shivers when passing corridors, and an almost compulsive need to recount experiences. The intensity of these first testimonies was heightened by the contrast between the innocence of the witnesses and the dark, silent figure that haunted them. The sisters attempted to corroborate these accounts with one another. Patterns began to emerge. The nun always appeared at midnight, her presence accompanied by an almost imperceptible chill and a faint, metallic scent in the air. She seemed drawn to individuals in moments of emotional vulnerability, lingering in mirrors as if aware of the observer's inner thoughts. When multiple novices claimed to have seen her at the same time, the figure's movements appeared synchronized, a detail that defied any rational explanation. Even the most skeptical members of the convent could not ignore the consistency of these experiences, and doubt began to erode the boundaries of belief. Tensions began to rise within the convent. Fear, once quiet and private, became a communal experience, seeping into every corner of the building. The novices, while still committed to their studies and prayers, moved through the halls with an alertness born of anxiety. Each mirror became a source of suspicion, each reflective surface a potential site of revelation. The older sisters, while outwardly composed, struggled with their own apprehensions, aware that the phenomenon could not be ignored or explained simply by exhaustion or imagination. Even mundane activities, such as preparing meals or tending the gardens, were shadowed by the possibility of an unseen observer, making the ordinary act of daily life fraught with unease. Outside the convent walls, the town began to take notice. Local residents, though initially skeptical, could sense a change in the convent's atmosphere. Neighbors reported glimpses of anxious figures moving through windows late at night, and rumors spread of strange reflections and eerie silences. Though details were scarce, the story began to gain traction, with whispers traveling along cobblestone streets and through market squares. The first witnesses' accounts, combined with the subtle external signs, created an emerging pattern that others could sense even if they had not seen it firsthand. The town itself, steeped in superstition and reverence for religious authority, became a receptive ground for the growing narrative. The first witnesses' courage in speaking out also brought internal conflict. Some sisters feared that public acknowledgement of the phenomenon could undermine the convent's reputation, while others argued that secrecy would only increase the psychological toll on those who were experiencing the apparitions. Meetings were held in hushed corridors, prayers offered for guidance, and meticulous records were kept of each encounter. The act of documenting these experiences lent them a sense of reality and weight that could no longer be dismissed. The presence of the nun was no longer a private terror, it had entered the collective consciousness of the convent and was beginning to extend into the broader community. Psychologically, the impact on the first witnesses was profound. Sleepless nights became common, with anxiety and fear eroding the mental and emotional equilibrium of those involved. Jean and her fellow novices began reporting vivid dreams in which the nun appeared outside of mirrors, following them through dark corridors or silently observing their prayers. These dreams, often indistinguishable from waking experiences, blurred the lines between reality and perception. The convent itself, once a sanctuary, became a space in which every reflection, every shadow, and every sudden sound carried the potential for confrontation with the unknown. The weight of the first testimonies was compounded by the growing isolation that fear imposed. Sisters began to move in smaller groups, avoiding solitary moments in front of mirrors. Even the communal activities, intended to foster unity, became exercises in vigilance, each participant scanning the reflective surfaces for signs of the apparition. The tension was not merely physical but emotional and psychological, permeating the air with a sense of expectancy. Every glance at a mirror, every flicker of candlelight, became charged with the possibility of revelation or terror. In this way, the first witnesses' accounts did more than document the phenomenon, they reshaped the very experience of living within the convent, creating an environment in which the supernatural and the psychological were inextricably intertwined. By the end of this period, the nun had transformed from a fleeting shadow to an undeniable presence within the convent. The first witnesses had articulated their experiences with precision and emotion, lending credibility and urgency to what had initially seemed like isolated, subjective anomalies. Their courage in speaking out initiated a chain reaction, drawing the attention of others and intensifying the collective apprehension. The stage was now set for the town at large to become aware, and for the phenomena to escalate beyond private reflection into a pervasive, communal mystery that would haunt Lyon and its inhabitants for years to come. Despite the growing number of witnesses, the religious authorities of Lyon reacted with a combination of dismissal and admonition, refusing to acknowledge the phenomenon as anything more than superstition or the product of imaginative minds. Sermons grew stern, emphasizing the dangers of giving credence to illusions and warning that those who spread such tales risked sinning through the indulgence of fear. Priests and senior convent leaders insisted that visions were the result of moral weakness or spiritual vulnerability, framing the reports as tests of faith rather than evidence of a supernatural presence. These denials created a tension between lived experience and institutional authority, forcing novices and staff to navigate a complex psychological terrain where speaking the truth could invite censure or judgment. The act of suppression only intensified the psychological weight of the phenomenon. Those who had seen the nun were made to feel that their experiences were invalid or sinful, leading to internal conflict and a growing sense of isolation. Jean, who had witnessed the figure multiple times, struggled with guilt and confusion, questioning whether her own spiritual inadequacy had somehow invited the apparition. Other novices displayed signs of anxiety and emotional exhaustion, aware that acknowledging the truth of what they had seen could result in admonishment, while remaining silent left them burdened by fear. The convent became a place where outward obedience clashed with private terror, and the atmosphere grew heavier with every unspoken acknowledgement of the phenomenon. Attempts at explanation from within the church were formal yet limited. Clergy members offered theological rationales, suggesting that the apparition might be a cautionary spirit, a messenger of divine reproof meant to test the faith of the devout. Confessional guidance reinforced the notion that fear was a spiritual challenge, encouraging novices to pray and perform penance rather than seek evidence or record their experiences publicly. While these explanations held weight in the context of the religious culture of the time, they failed to account for the precise timing of the nuns' appearances, the patterns observed across multiple witnesses, and the profound psychological impact on those affected. The dichotomy between official denial and lived experience heightened tension, creating fertile ground for rumor, speculation, and a creeping sense of paranoia. Within the convent, whispers continued to circulate, though now filtered through a lens of caution. Sisters spoke in hushed tones, careful to avoid accusation or admonition from authority figures, yet determined to share their observations. The veil of secrecy added a layer of intensity to every account. The figure in the mirrors was no longer a fleeting anomaly, she had become a subject of shared fear, a presence whose influence extended beyond isolated incidents. The social dynamics of the convent shifted, with trust being tested by suspicion and communal bonds strained by fear. Observers began to notice subtle behavioral changes. Some sisters avoided mirrors altogether, others displayed hyper-awareness of reflections in the rooms they occupied, and small disagreements emerged over the interpretation of events. The tension between personal experience and public denial shaped the daily life of the convent, creating an environment of heightened psychological pressure. The town beyond the convent walls became aware of growing unease, though details remained sparse. Traders, neighbors, and casual passers-by began noting a change in the convent's energy, a sense of quiet vigilance that had replaced the usual serenity. Children of townsfolk spoke in frightened whispers about shadows in mirrors or fleeting figures glimpsed from windows, often dismissed by adults yet adding to the accumulating narrative. Townspeople speculated cautiously, framing the phenomenon in terms of folklore, superstition, and divine testing, all while avoiding direct confrontation with the unknown. The interplay between external skepticism and internal fear reinforced the sense of mystery, allowing rumors to spread organically and intensify collective apprehension. Psychologically, the denial imposed by authority created a duality for those affected. On one hand, they were encouraged to suppress acknowledgement of what they had seen, on the other, the vividness of the appearances demanded recognition. This conflict produced both internal and interpersonal stress, as individuals struggled to reconcile their sensory experiences with the expectation of obedience. Jean and several of her peers began documenting incidents secretly, keeping careful mental or written notes of timing, circumstances, and physical sensations associated with the appearances. These private records became crucial, not only as a personal coping mechanism but also as a means of creating an informal archive that might one day explain the inexplicable. The social isolation created by suppression was reinforced by changes in communal behavior. Sisters moved more cautiously, often avoiding solitary passages, preferring to travel in small groups when traversing the convent's corridors. Candles were carried at unusual hours, and mirrors were covered or deliberately avoided. Each precaution, while intended to maintain a sense of safety, paradoxically reinforced the idea that the presence was real and potentially threatening. Fear became performative and self-reinforcing, each act of caution a subtle acknowledgement of the phenomena that the Church publicly denied. The boundaries between reality and perception began to blur, and the convent transformed from a sanctuary of spiritual discipline to a tense environment dominated by vigilance and anticipation. Even attempts at rationalization offered little solace. Some sisters hypothesized that the apparition was the projection of collective anxiety, an amalgamation of their own fears and guilt manifesting in reflective surfaces. Others suggested that the nun represented a moral allegory, a living embodiment of penance or divine warning. While these ideas offered intellectual frameworks for understanding the events, they did little to mitigate the emotional intensity of the experiences. Observers could rationalize the figure in theory but could not undo the visceral fear that gripped them when confronted by her reflection at midnight. The tension between reason and lived experience became a defining feature of daily life, a persistent cognitive dissonance that left the convent poised on the brink of psychological collapse. By the end of this period, the denial and suppression imposed by religious authorities had paradoxically amplified the influence of the apparition. The first formal witnesses, emboldened to share their experiences privately, had ignited a chain of awareness within the convent that authority could not fully control. Fear became a quiet, pervasive force, shaping behavior, interactions, and perception. The veil of institutional denial created a fertile ground for rumor and internal speculation, allowing the nun's presence to solidify as both a psychological and supernatural phenomenon. The stage was now set for escalation, as the tension between lived experience, communal fear, and official denial created a perfect environment for the mystery to deepen, drawing both the inhabitants of the convent and the surrounding town further into a web of uncertainty, dread, and suspense. The appearances of the nun grew more frequent and insistent, no longer limited to fleeting reflections in mirrors but gradually asserting themselves in ways that could not be ignored. Those who had previously glimpsed her now described a presence that seemed to linger, a weight in the air that pressed upon the chest and quickened the heartbeat. It was no longer simply a visual phenomenon, the air in the corridors carried a chill, a metallic tang that unsettled even the most steadfast sisters. Jean, whose initial encounter had set the stage for the unfolding mystery, now found herself involuntarily drawn to reflective surfaces, as if compelled to confront the figure despite her fear. The tension within the convent escalated, saturating every space with a sense of unease that could not be escaped. The novices, many of whom had entered the convent with innocence and devotion, began to exhibit changes in behavior that alarmed the older sisters. Some became withdrawn, speaking less and avoiding communal prayers, while others displayed sudden bursts of anxiety or hysteria when passing mirrors or polished surfaces. Even mundane activities, such as drawing water from the well or tending the gardens, were accompanied by a heightened vigilance, each shadow or flicker of light interpreted as a potential sign of the nun's presence. This atmosphere of constant tension created a feedback loop: fear heightened perception, perception confirmed fear, and the cycle repeated relentlessly. The ordinary rhythms of convent life were replaced by a state of quiet, persistent dread, shaping both daily routines and emotional well-being. The psychological impact of the nuns' escalating appearances became increasingly profound. Jean admitted to experiencing moments of paralysis, frozen before mirrors, as if the figure could see not only her reflection but her innermost thoughts and fears. Dreams grew vivid and unsettling, blending the boundaries between waking life and imagination, often leaving the sisters unsure whether what they had seen was real or a product of their own minds. Even the most devout members of the convent began to question their understanding of reality, wondering whether faith alone could protect them from the inexplicable presence that had taken root in their home. This pervasive uncertainty intensified the emotional stakes, creating a collective tension that bound the novices and sisters together in a shared, uneasy vigilance. Reports of the nuns' influence began to extend beyond the convent itself. Some of the young novices claimed to sense her presence even when visiting relatives or walking through the streets of Lyon during the day. Glimpses of shadowed figures in windows, fleeting reflections in polished shop fronts, and sudden chills in otherwise ordinary spaces suggested that the apparition's reach was not confined to the convent. These accounts, though sporadic, contributed to a growing sense that the phenomenon was part of a larger, more mysterious pattern. Townspeople, initially skeptical, began to take notice of subtle changes in behavior among the novices who returned home, noting an anxiety or solemnity that seemed unusual for their age. The escalation also manifested in more overt disruptions within the convent. Objects occasionally shifted from their places without explanation, a book left on a table would appear on a windowsill, a chair slightly angled as if recently used, and candles would flicker even in the absence of wind. These minor, seemingly innocuous disturbances carried a symbolic weight, reinforcing the sense that the nun's presence was active and intentional. Observers noted a heightened sensitivity to reflective surfaces. Mirrors became sites of dread rather than tools, polished metal or glass serving as portals to an unnerving reality. The physical environment of the convent itself seemed to respond to the psychological state of its inhabitants, amplifying tension and reinforcing the narrative of a presence that was both unseen and deeply felt. Conflict within the convent's hierarchy emerged as the intensity of the appearances increased. Some senior sisters advocated for strict adherence to routine and spiritual discipline, insisting that fear could be conquered through prayer and obedience. Others, witnessing the escalating psychological toll, argued for a more cautious approach, reducing nighttime activities and limiting exposure to reflective surfaces. These differing strategies created tension between those who prioritized faith as protection and those who sought to mitigate psychological strain. The result was a fragile balance, with fear permeating every decision, every interaction, and every observation, leaving the convent in a state of collective unease. The emotional consequences for the novices were profound. Jean, along with several others, described a sense of being watched even when alone, a sensation that provoked both fear and fascination. Sleep became increasingly fragmented, with dreams dominated by the nun's figure appearing in mirrors, hallways, or distant shadows. Some began to avoid mirrors entirely, covering them or refusing to enter rooms where reflective surfaces were present. Others, paradoxically, felt compelled to confront the figure, as though seeking answers that remained perpetually out of reach. These behaviors illustrate the complex psychological interplay between curiosity, fear, and the human drive for understanding in the face of the inexplicable. The town outside the convent began to sense a shift as well, though indirectly. Subtle signs of unrest and unease in the behavior of the novices returning to their families spread awareness of the mysterious occurrences. Neighbors observed pallor, anxiety, and tense comportment, while whispers of supernatural presence circulated cautiously, framed as folklore rather than documented reality. The escalating tension within the convent, though primarily internal, created ripples that extended into the wider community, planting seeds of apprehension that would later contribute to the town's growing engagement with the phenomenon. By the end of this period, the nuns' presence had become a defining force within the convent, shaping both the physical and psychological landscape. Fear had moved beyond subtle suggestion into a sustained, persistent reality that affected daily routines, sleep, social interaction, and mental stability. The escalation of appearances, combined with the impossibility of rational explanation or relief through prayer alone, transformed the convent from a place of quiet devotion into a crucible of tension, where the boundaries between the ordinary and the supernatural had grown thin and fragile. Every mirror, every shadow, and every moment of solitude carried the possibility of confrontation, preparing the way for the next phase, in which attempts at understanding would clash with the relentless, unnerving persistence of the unknown. As the nuns' presence persisted with an unnerving consistency, a select group of scholars, physicians, and skeptical members of the convent felt compelled to confront the mystery through systematic observation and rational inquiry. These individuals, both curious and determined, sought to impose some form of order on what had, until this point, appeared entirely chaotic. Their goal was simple yet daunting: to reconcile the seemingly supernatural events with the principles of logic, science, and reason. Each approach was pursued meticulously, employing observation, documentation, and experimentation to uncover patterns or rules that might explain the nuns' nightly appearances. Early attempts focused on physiological explanations. Fatigue, stress, and the rigors of nocturnal duties were analyzed in detail, with investigators proposing that exhaustion could induce hallucinations or misperceptions. Candlelight flickering across uneven stone floors, shadows cast by architecture, and the reflective distortion of old mirrors were all considered as potential triggers. These mundane factors were examined rigorously, yet no combination could fully account for the nun's precise timing, the consistency of her movements, or the psychological weight she seemed to impose. Witnesses, even when well-rested and alert, continued to perceive her presence with an intensity that defied conventional understanding. The disconnect between rational explanation and lived experience became increasingly evident, leaving the investigators both intrigued and unsettled. The study soon expanded to include psychological phenomena. Theories of mass suggestion and collective anxiety were explored in detail. Could the nun be a projection of shared fears, a collective hallucination generated by the emotional environment of the convent? Detailed notes were taken on the emotional states of each observer, documenting stress levels, religious devotion, and prior experiences that might predispose individuals to heightened perception. While these studies offered partial insight into why multiple novices experienced similar encounters, they failed to explain certain inexplicable elements: the figure's precise movements, her seemingly deliberate engagement with observers, and the chilling sense of awareness that accompanied each appearance. Even in controlled conditions, where lighting and environmental variables were manipulated, the nun appeared with an unpredictability that suggested she was operating independently of human expectation. Scientific reasoning led to methodical experimentation within the convent itself. Mirrors were repositioned, reflective surfaces covered, and corridors illuminated in unusual ways. Observers tested variations in candlelight, room arrangement, and timing to determine whether the apparition could be influenced or provoked. These attempts were recorded meticulously, with careful attention paid to observer accounts, environmental factors, and even the emotional states of those present. Yet the results were confounding. The figure's appearances remained irregular and seemingly independent of all external variables. The nun's persistence challenged the very foundation of empirical inquiry, demonstrating that some phenomena may exist outside the parameters of observable causality. Each failed attempt at prediction reinforced the sense that her presence was deliberate and self-determined, heightening both fear and fascination. Theological frameworks were introduced alongside empirical methods, creating an uneasy intersection of faith and reason. Some scholars posited that the apparition might serve as a divine messenger, an embodiment of moral warning, or a test of spiritual resilience. The use of prayer, ritual observation, and reflection on scripture were integrated with more empirical studies in an attempt to find coherence between spiritual belief and physical phenomena. Even these theological interventions, however, failed to diminish the figure's presence. If anything, the deliberate inclusion of sacred texts and rituals appeared to amplify attention to her appearances, as though the nun were cognizant of the observer's attempts to understand or control her. The blending of rational inquiry and spiritual reflection highlighted the complex challenge of confronting a presence that simultaneously occupied physical, psychological, and metaphysical dimensions. The dynamic between the observer and the apparition became increasingly sophisticated. Sisters who deliberately watched mirrors reported an intensification of the figure's presence. The nun seemed to respond to scrutiny, her reflection clearer, her gaze more deliberate, and her form more defined when attention was consciously directed toward her. This responsiveness suggested a level of awareness that transcended simple reflection or projection. Observers found themselves trapped in a paradox. The act of observation, intended to rationalize or document the phenomenon, increased the intensity of the encounter. Curiosity and fear intertwined, creating a feedback loop in which vigilance provoked manifestation, and manifestation reinforced vigilance. The convent's interior environment had become a psychological landscape in which perception, anticipation, and supernatural presence were inseparable. The psychological consequences of sustained observation were profound. Novices reported sleepless nights, haunted by dreams in which the figure moved outside of reflective surfaces, appearing in hallways, doorways, and distant corners of rooms. Waking moments were marked by hypervigilance, with even subtle shadows interpreted as potential manifestations. Anxiety became omnipresent, and emotional resilience was tested daily. Jean, in particular, found her curiosity and sense of duty as a witness in constant tension with paralyzing fear. Attempts to maintain composure and rational observation required immense psychological effort, highlighting the strain imposed by the persistent and unpredictable presence of the nun. Social dynamics within the convent also shifted under the weight of the phenomenon. Scholars, skeptics, and devout adherents interacted in ways that reflected both cooperation and subtle tension. Those dedicated to rational inquiry were respected for their methodical approach, yet sometimes distrusted as provocateurs who might inadvertently attract the apparition. Sisters who emphasized spiritual devotion and prayer were alternately seen as courageous or overly fearful. These contrasting approaches created a fragile equilibrium, wherein observation and belief coexisted uneasily, with fear subtly influencing every interaction. The convent, in effect, had become an ecosystem in which psychology, spirituality, and the inexplicable merged to shape communal life. Over time, the nun's persistence began to influence even external perceptions. Townspeople occasionally noted subtle changes in the demeanor of visiting novices, pallor, tension, and cautious movements that suggested anxiety or premonition. These indirect effects spread awareness beyond the convent, allowing the narrative of the apparition to permeate public consciousness. Rumors, carefully framed as superstition or folklore, circulated in markets and among households, providing a social echo of the psychological phenomena occurring within the convent walls. The figure's influence had thus extended beyond immediate observation, shaping behavior and perception on both private and public scales. By the end of this stage, the nun had become more than a reflection, she had evolved into a persistent, psychologically potent force that defied conventional understanding. Rational investigation, spiritual intervention, and systematic observation had all failed to contain, predict, or fully explain her appearances. Every effort to apply human logic only revealed the limits of perception when confronted with phenomena that resisted categorization. The persistent, responsive, and unpredictable nature of the apparition had reshaped the convent's interior life, altered interpersonal dynamics, and extended its influence to the surrounding town, creating a web of fear, fascination, and uncertainty that could not be undone. Observers were left with the stark realization that the phenomenon existed beyond conventional frameworks. The nun's appearances demanded recognition and respect, not merely as spiritual or psychological events but as experiences that fundamentally challenged assumptions about reality. The convent's environment had become a living, interactive field in which emotion, observation, and perception were intertwined with the supernatural, producing a state of collective tension and heightened awareness that left no participant untouched. The stage was set for the next phase of escalation, in which the interplay between perception, belief, and the unexplained would continue to unfold, shaping the history and legacy of the convent and the town itself. The escalation of the phenomenon reached a point where ordinary routines could no longer continue without constant vigilance. The nuns' appearances had become increasingly audacious, manifesting in broader locations throughout the convent and no longer limited to mirrors alone. Reflections in polished wood, silver utensils, and even puddles of water on stone floors occasionally revealed her presence, each instance leaving an indelible impression on those who witnessed it. Jean and several of the novices reported feeling a tangible weight in the air, as if the space itself recognized her arrival. Every corridor, every chapel, every silent chamber seemed to hold the potential for confrontation, making the convent a site of perpetual tension and anxious anticipation. Attempts to rationalize or ignore the phenomenon proved futile. Observers found that no action could entirely prevent the apparition from appearing, and even the act of avoidance often heightened awareness. Novices would instinctively glance toward a reflection, even when they sought to avert their gaze, drawn by a compulsion that was part fear, part curiosity. The psychological strain intensified, producing sleep disturbances, heightened anxiety, and occasional panic. Jean, who had become both observer and reluctant participant in this unfolding mystery, described moments of paralysis, unable to move as the nun appeared in the reflection before her. The intensity of these encounters reinforced a sense of inescapable presence, embedding the supernatural firmly within the daily experience of the convent's inhabitants. The isolation imposed by fear created subtle divisions among the sisters. Some attempted to maintain composure through devout practice, engaging in longer hours of prayer or meditation to fortify their spirits against the unsettling force. Others, more sensitive or overwhelmed, withdrew into smaller, quieter spaces, avoiding communal gatherings whenever possible. These shifts disrupted social cohesion, as mutual trust and reassurance were strained by the constant anticipation of confrontation. Observers began to notice a marked change in interpersonal dynamics, with whispered exchanges replacing open conversation and shared activities increasingly conducted under the weight of silent apprehension. The convent, once a structured haven of discipline and devotion, had become a crucible of fear, where every interaction was colored by the invisible presence that haunted its halls. The psychological influence of the nun extended beyond the convent's immediate interior. Even in moments of sunlight or outdoor activity, the sisters described a lingering tension, a sense that she was aware of their movements and thoughts regardless of location. Reports of fleeting shadows, reflections in polished surfaces outside the convent, and the sensation of unseen observation amplified the feeling of being constantly monitored. Each occurrence, however subtle, reinforced the perception of omnipresence, creating a state in which the ordinary world was continually interlaced with the extraordinary. Fear, once contained and episodic, had become a pervasive aspect of consciousness, influencing not only behavior but the interpretation of reality itself. The broader community, while still largely outside direct experience, began to sense a shift in the convent's energy. Townspeople noted a change in the demeanor of the novices who occasionally left for errands or visits, their movements tense, their expressions wary, as if carrying a weight too heavy to articulate. Rumors spread slowly at first, whispered along market stalls and through family gatherings, yet the consistency of reports lent credence to the narrative. The presence of the nun was no longer confined to private accounts, it had begun to insinuate itself into the collective consciousness of Lyon. These early signs of public awareness were subtle but consequential, marking the transition from isolated encounters to a broader acknowledgement that something inexplicable was at work. Internal attempts to confront the phenomenon intensified. Scholars and clerics within the convent explored combinations of observation, prayer, and ritual to discern patterns or influence the apparition's behavior. Mirrors were methodically monitored, lighting was adjusted, and group observations were attempted to create controlled conditions for witnessing. Despite meticulous records and careful procedures, the nun's presence remained unpredictable. These failed efforts highlighted the limits of both empirical and spiritual approaches, reinforcing the notion that she existed outside conventional frameworks of understanding. Each encounter, therefore, carried a dual weight, the immediate psychological impact and the broader existential implication that some forces could not be fully understood or contained. The cumulative effect of these escalations was profound. Jean, who had initially been both terrified and fascinated, found herself increasingly compelled to observe the apparition, despite the emotional cost. The tension between fear and curiosity created a cycle in which anticipation heightened perception, and perception, in turn, intensified emotional response. Other novices displayed variations of this response, with some retreating entirely into isolation and others engaging in quiet, ritualized observation in an attempt to maintain a semblance of control. The interplay of these behaviors created an environment of constant suspense, where fear was interwoven with the mundane, shaping both thought and action. By this stage, the phenomenon had transcended mere spectacle and had begun to alter the very texture of life within the convent. The nun's presence had become a force that structured behavior, attention, and emotion, imposing its rhythm upon the daily routines of all who lived there. Every reflection, shadow, and silent corridor became a site of potential revelation or confrontation, creating a pervasive psychological framework in which ordinary experience was inseparable from the extraordinary. The stage was now set for the next chapter of the mystery, one in which the boundaries between perception, reality, and belief would be tested to their limits, and the emotional consequences of prolonged exposure to the unknown would begin to unfold with greater intensity. The relentless persistence of the nun's presence within the convent had begun to erode the very foundations of daily life. The initial fear, which had once flickered like a candle in the minds of the novices, had evolved into a pervasive anxiety that colored every thought, action, and interaction. Ordinary routines, prayer, study, chores, communal meals, had been transformed into exercises in hypervigilance. Every movement was shadowed by the possibility of encountering the figure, and every reflective surface became a potential site of revelation or terror. The convent itself, once a sanctuary of spiritual discipline and predictable rhythm, had become a labyrinth of psychological tension, a place where the ordinary and the extraordinary were inextricably intertwined. Isolation became a defining feature of life. Novices, aware of the intensity of the apparition, sought the comfort of pairs or small groups, finding in each other a fragile sense of reassurance. Yet even in company, the feeling of vulnerability persisted. Mirrors, windows, polished utensils, and even puddles of water were approached with a mixture of caution and dread. Jean, whose acute observations had already marked her as both witness and reluctant chronicler, found herself caught between fear and compulsion, unable to resist documenting each appearance while simultaneously dreading the next encounter. Her meticulous records, initially intended to serve as a means of understanding, became both a burden and a lifeline, a way to assert control over what seemed uncontrollable, and yet a constant reminder of the persistent force that haunted the convent's corridors. The influence of the nun extended beyond the convent walls, seeping subtly into the surrounding community. Novices who ventured into town carried with them an aura of unease, their movements tense, their glances wary, their speech measured and cautious. Families and neighbors noticed a marked change in behavior, the once bright and lively young women appeared pallid, anxious, and guarded. Rumors began to circulate in hushed tones, initially dismissed as superstition, yet the consistency of reports lent credibility to the narrative. Whispers of shadows in windows, fleeting figures in reflective surfaces, and unexplained chills contributed to a growing communal sense of apprehension. Even without direct contact, the nuns' presence had begun to influence perception and expectation, creating a social ripple that extended well beyond the convent's walls. Attempts to rationalize or confront the phenomenon continued but offered diminishing relief. Scholars and clerics persisted in their investigations, meticulously recording the conditions of each appearance, experimenting with variations in lighting, and observing the psychological states of witnesses. Yet these efforts yielded little conclusive evidence. The figure remained unpredictable, appearing at times when all known variables had been controlled and abstaining when conditions were seemingly ideal. This unpredictability intensified the sense of helplessness, leaving observers caught between the desire to understand and the realization that comprehension might forever elude them. Each encounter reinforced the figure's agency, a silent acknowledgement that the nun operated outside the parameters of human expectation and control. Psychological consequences became increasingly pronounced. Sleep, once a refuge, offered no escape. Dreams were invaded by the figure, appearing in mirrors, doorways, and shadowed corridors with a silent, deliberate presence. Novices described sensations of being watched even when alone, their attention drawn involuntarily to reflections or subtle movements in peripheral vision. Hypervigilance became the default state of consciousness, and emotional exhaustion was widespread. Jean, in particular, experienced the dual burden of fear and fascination, compelled to observe while simultaneously aware of the toll it exacted on her mind and body. The convent's atmosphere became saturated with tension, a persistent, almost tangible pressure that shaped thought, action, and perception in ways that ordinary life could no longer accommodate. Social dynamics within the convent began to shift dramatically under the influence of sustained fear. Trust, cohesion, and authority were strained as individuals reacted differently to the persistent phenomenon. Some novices adhered strictly to devotional practices, seeking protection through prayer and ritual, while others withdrew into isolation, overwhelmed by anxiety. Tensions arose between those attempting to impose rational understanding and those guided by faith, each group struggling to interpret events within its own framework. Fear subtly dictated interactions, reshaping relationships and communication. Whispered conversations replaced open dialogue, caution became habitual, and even seemingly innocuous actions, turning a corner, entering a room, moving a mirror, were fraught with unspoken tension. The convent had become a microcosm of anxiety, where the collective psyche was as much a stage for the apparition as the physical corridors themselves. The nuns' influence also provoked adaptive yet maladaptive behaviors. Some novices began to create elaborate mental and physical strategies for survival, tracking time meticulously, mapping reflective surfaces, and rehearsing responses to potential encounters. These behaviors, while offering a sense of control, simultaneously reinforced the figure's omnipresence. Every precaution was an acknowledgement of the threat she posed, and every anticipatory action became a conduit for the psychological intensity of her presence. Even ordinary domestic tasks, sweeping, fetching water, preparing meals, were performed with heightened attention to light, reflection, and spatial awareness. Daily life became a complex choreography of avoidance and observation, dictated not by routine or ritual alone, but by the persistent, enigmatic figure whose presence hovered at the edge of perception. The emotional landscape of the convent grew increasingly complex. Jean oscillated between terror, fascination, and resignation. Moments of courage, in which she attempted deliberate observation or documentation, were followed by periods of emotional depletion, where fear and exhaustion dominated. Other novices displayed similar patterns, creating a spectrum of responses that ranged from hypervigilant engagement to complete withdrawal. Emotional bonds, though tested, also provided fragile support. Shared experiences of fear created a subtle solidarity, a recognition that survival required both attention and mutual reassurance. The convent had become a living laboratory of psychological endurance, in which fear, curiosity, and observation intertwined to shape cognition, emotion, and behavior. The spatial and architectural environment of the convent itself contributed to the intensity of the phenomenon. Corridors, chapels, and cells became imbued with tension, with every mirror, polished surface, and window a potential site of encounter. Physical space was inseparable from psychological space. The act of moving through the convent became a constant negotiation between caution and necessity. Even in daylight, shadows cast by furniture, columns, or trees outside were interpreted through the lens of heightened perception, reinforcing the omnipresent nature of the apparition. The figure's influence, once confined to the act of reflection, had expanded into the very experience of inhabiting space, shaping how each individual moved, thought, and felt within the convent's walls. The phenomenon's persistence began to shape broader perceptions of reality. Novices reported experiences that blurred the boundaries between imagination and observation, dreams and waking life. The nun's presence was experienced not merely as visual but as an encompassing psychological and emotional force. Anxiety, expectation, and anticipation intertwined with perception, creating an altered consciousness in which ordinary sensory input was constantly interpreted through the lens of potential encounter. The convent became a liminal space, where the supernatural, the psychological, and the ordinary coexisted in a state of heightened tension and uncertainty. The stage was thus set for the convent's eventual psychological and social unraveling. Rational explanation had proven insufficient, ritual provided only partial solace, and the figure's omnipresence dictated both behavior and perception. Fear had become structural, embedded in every interaction, every task, and every reflective surface. Jean and her fellow novices navigated an environment where observation and anticipation were inseparable from daily life, and where the boundaries between self, community, and the unexplained were increasingly blurred. The narrative of the nun had evolved from a series of isolated encounters to a persistent, shaping force, influencing the convent, the town, and the collective consciousness of all who lived within the orbit of her presence. The psychological and social consequences of prolonged exposure to the phenomenon were profound. Emotional exhaustion, hypervigilance, and disrupted sleep patterns undermined both individual and communal resilience. Social hierarchies and interpersonal trust were strained, as fear dictated engagement and avoidance. Behavioral adaptations, while offering a sense of control, simultaneously reinforced the intensity of the experience, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of observation, expectation, and psychological tension. The convent had become a microcosm of sustained uncertainty, a space in which the extraordinary had fully infiltrated the ordinary, reshaping the mental and emotional lives of its inhabitants. By the end of this period, the nun had become more than an apparition, she had transformed into a persistent, shaping presence. Her appearances dictated behavior, influenced perception, and structured the daily and nightly rhythms of the convent. Rational inquiry, spiritual practice, and careful observation provided insight but not control. Fear had become pervasive, observation compulsive, and anticipation constant. The figure existed as both a psychological and supernatural force, an enduring presence that resisted explanation and dominated the lived experience of all who dwelled within the convent's walls. The stage was prepared for the next chapter of the mystery, in which the psychological, spiritual, and communal consequences of prolonged exposure would intersect with events that challenged understanding, perception, and the very notion of reality itself. The culmination of the nun's presence within the convent had reached a point where the very fabric of daily life seemed governed by her silent observation. The previous attempts to rationalize, document, or mitigate the phenomenon had only provided temporary reprieve, each effort revealing the futility of controlling what appeared to operate according to its own inscrutable rules. The figure, once glimpsed fleetingly in mirrors, had grown into a persistent force, shaping behavior, perception, and emotional equilibrium in ways that could not be ignored. Every polished surface became a potential conduit for encounter, every shadowed corridor a site of latent threat. Those who had previously dismissed the experiences now understood that this was no longer a matter of imagination but a pervasive reality that dictated life within the convent's walls. Jean, who had served as both witness and reluctant chronicler, found herself at the center of the unfolding crisis. Each night she moved through the convent with heightened awareness, mentally mapping reflective surfaces, noting angles of light, and anticipating the nun's next appearance. Her observations, detailed and methodical, served as both record and survival mechanism, but they came at a profound emotional cost. Fear and fascination coexisted in her consciousness, a duality that left her physically tense and psychologically fatigued. Sleep offered little solace. Dreams were invaded by the figure, sometimes appearing in mirrors, sometimes emerging from shadows, always silent but intensely present. The boundary between waking reality and dream had become porous, and even daytime activity carried the weight of anticipation. The psychological impact on the broader community of novices and sisters was equally severe. Isolation became a necessity, though one that only reinforced fear. Novices paired or grouped together for safety, yet the sense of being constantly observed persisted. Mirrors were covered or avoided, windows scrutinized, and reflective surfaces removed from communal areas whenever possible. Routine activities, from the preparation of meals to the maintenance of gardens, were conducted under the tension of vigilant anticipation. Even the most mundane tasks carried an unspoken dread, as if any action might provoke an appearance or reveal the nun's scrutiny. The convent itself had transformed from a space of spiritual discipline to a labyrinth of psychological strain, in which every movement was shadowed by fear. Despite these precautions, the figure's presence became increasingly invasive. Reports of partial apparitions outside mirrors began to circulate. A fleeting shadow crossing the cloister, a spectral figure glimpsed at the periphery of vision, and the sensation of unseen observation beyond reflective surfaces reinforced the perception of omnipresence. No space was entirely safe, and the psychological weight of unpredictability intensified. The constant threat of encounter eroded confidence, creating a pervasive state of hypervigilance. Sleep deprivation, heightened anxiety, and emotional exhaustion became widespread, leaving the community vulnerable to both the direct and indirect consequences of sustained psychological strain. Attempts at external intervention were limited but persistent. Some clergy members and scholars sought to investigate, employing both scientific reasoning and theological analysis to interpret the phenomenon. Detailed records of timing, lighting, and observer behavior were maintained, and attempts were made to manipulate conditions to observe variations in the nun's appearances. Yet, the figure remained inscrutable, appearing according to its own logic, unaffected by controlled environments or attempts at rational intervention. Even ritual, once a source of comfort and authority, offered limited mitigation. Prayer, meditation, and ceremonial observances were employed in earnest, yet the figure's presence was unaltered, leaving observers to contend with both spiritual and psychological uncertainty. The interaction between observer and apparition became increasingly complex. The nun seemed attuned to attention, responding to observation with clarity and precision. Those who deliberately sought to witness her reported a heightened intensity, as if the figure acknowledged scrutiny and amplified her presence accordingly. This responsiveness created a perilous dynamic: curiosity provoked encounter, and encounter intensified psychological strain. Novices experienced a simultaneous compulsion to observe and an instinctive desire to flee, a tension that deepened fear and reinforced the perception of inescapability. The convent's internal environment had evolved into a matrix in which observation, emotion, and supernatural presence were inseparably intertwined. The broader town began to perceive subtle, indirect effects. Novices who occasionally ventured into public spaces carried with them an aura of unease, their movements tense, their glances wary. Stories of shadows in windows, fleeting reflections in polished storefronts, and inexplicable chills began to circulate, though filtered through the lens of rumor and caution. Even without direct encounter, the narrative of the nun had begun to shape communal perception, extending her influence beyond the convent itself. The figure had become both a private terror and a public concern, its presence creating a shared, if partially speculative, understanding of mystery and threat. Within the convent, behavioral patterns continued to evolve in response to the persistent phenomenon. Sisters and novices developed strategies to cope, avoidance of reflective surfaces, pairing for mutual reassurance, heightened attention to angles of light, and ritualized observation intended to predict or prepare for appearances. These behaviors, while adaptive, also reinforced the nuns' influence, creating a feedback loop in which fear dictated both perception and action. The convent, in its entirety, became a space structured around the anticipation of encounter, where every reflective surface, shadow, and corridor bore potential significance. Ordinary life had become inseparable from the extraordinary, and every action was shaded by the possibility of confrontation. Emotionally, the impact was profound. Jean and other close witnesses described oscillations between terror, fascination, and resignation. Moments of courage, deliberate observation or attempts to confront the apparition, were tempered by the deep psychological fatigue that accompanied sustained vigilance. Emotional bonds within the convent were strained, as fear created subtle divisions. Some sought reassurance, others withdrew into isolation, and a few oscillated between both. The shared experience of terror, however, also fostered a fragile solidarity, a recognition that survival required both awareness and mutual support. The convent had become a living laboratory of psychological endurance, shaped by the interplay of the visible, the reflective, and the unseen. The stage was set for the final resolution, though clarity remained elusive. The nuns' presence had transformed from isolated glimpses to pervasive influence, dictating behavior, perception, and emotion within the convent and affecting the broader community through indirect observation and rumor. Rational explanation had failed, ritual provided partial relief at best, and fear had become a structural component of daily life. The narrative now existed in a state of tension. The supernatural, the psychological, and the social dynamics of the community were interwoven in a manner that defied conventional understanding. The culmination of these experiences left the convent poised on the precipice of historical significance. Each encounter, each observation, and each response had contributed to a layered understanding of the nuns' presence, blending the realms of the observable and the unknowable. The figure's persistence, responsiveness, and unpredictability had shaped not only perception but also the very environment in which the sisters and novices lived. The story of her appearances, meticulously recorded and orally transmitted, would become a legacy of fear, fascination, and unresolved mystery, a testament to the limits of reason and the enduring power of the inexplicable.